It's preparing a live stream.
Yay!
All
We're
right.
live.
It's preparing a live.
Oh
Yes.
boy.
We're live
Hi.
and I am muted because reasons.
Yeah, we are totes muted. We can see the chat. So hi. We'll patter while we wait for some questions, I think, to come in. Or
Yeah,
you some questions.
Yeah. No, I think that will be good.
I do want to say how hilarious it was that the chat basically blew up with the one thing that we don't talk about in this presentation, which is that you and I are part of an 18th century flavor Dungeons and Dragons game that has a Jane Austen character in it.
Yes.
So we will have a video coming up about that.
Yes.
To the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University has an amazing set of resources, and I'm going to talk about how I set up a very capacious D&D campaign.
Yes.
And also, hopefully, it'll be platform agnostic. I think one of the things that is useful to talk about is we are big supporters of indie games.
Yes.
Yeah. So, hey, Alice, we're back.
Good. Someone's here. I'm going to just put in our comments.
Yeah, so we've got some time before the next session on the hour, which we're so excited about, which is why Austenland is the best modern film reinterpretation of Jane Austen's work by Kate and Kat. So it's Em and Emily, followed by Kate and Kat here on Jane Con, because we're nerds like that.
Yeah. Okay.
So
good. And I have the comments going. We can see that, and we don't need.
Thanks, George. Yeah, it's, you're never too old and too far from your dissertation to be glad when your advisors drop into your talk. Exactly. We won't mention how many years it's been. So yeah. So we're happy to answer questions, make game recommendations. There's so many games we haven't talked about. Shout out to the next thing we're going to be playing with our experimental game group, which is Grant Hewitt's one-pager Pride and Extreme Prejudice. Grant is most famous for his game Honey Heist, where you play bears who are in danger of going criminal or feral. It's a very simple mechanic, can be taught very quickly. We're going to see how that plays.
Yeah.
Could you hold a D&D campaign set in the 18th century?
We do.
George Justice, I do it. You can come. It's in 2 weeks. It's on Saturday night for like an hour. The way that we do it is any 18th century character, fictional or historical, you can roll up a character and play them. So
right. I will also add that though for the most part, our 18th century game is centered around Robert Walpole's time. Not Robert Walpole, Horace.
Yeah. Let's not mix those up.
Better Walpole.
The OG.
We have time travel to other parts of the long century.
Yeah, we do some timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. It's useful that, Horace lived for much of the 18th century in some ways. You can kind of hand wave it as he's kind of an ageless eldritch being, and that Strawberry Hill somehow has always existed. In terms of rule set, I think there are better rule sets, right? Like Good Society is doing interesting stuff. Other games have tried to kind of create. I am not a believer that D&D is like the universal tool. However, as I'm going to talk about in the video about why I used 5th edition D&D to create a Dungeons and Dragons campaign at the American Society for 18th Century Studies a few years ago, it's because people have heard of D&D.
Right.
There is a critique that D&D, which is often touted as a gateway game, is actually a game that kind of sucks you in and doesn't let you explore other role-playing games. And I'm hoping that that's not the case. But D&D people are curious about it, want to play it in different kinds of ways. there's been a lot of tinkering, thanks to, various homebrew and extensions. So
yeah.
I will totally send you a calendar invite, George.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I mentioned that we're genre agnostic. There's been many different types of adventures. We're on a boat right now.
So Sarah, our game is not spooky and it's not gothic. Although the first session was set at Strawberry Hill, I'm going to talk about how I used the Walpole's extensive digitization of the map and grounds and like all of the inventory of the building to create a kind of spooky experience for my characters. Right. But the reality is when you play with 18th century scholars, which is basically what this party is, they are remarkably conflict averse. They only accidentally kill things a lot of the time, unless it's like basically the stakes are very, very high. And so, as with all role playing, a successful campaign is a story where people are having fun. And so if they're going to run it on a pacifist run, I'm going to figure out a way to do it. Candlekeep Mysteries, which is the latest official D&D supplement, is something we're playing out of, which is great for book history nerds because it's all about a magical library full of cool books. There's, some annoying things about the production history of things like Candlekeep Mysteries, where so much has been gutted of the independent contractor authors. That's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but yeah. So we're, I'm trying to find, what I have found is I run a lot of one shots that have been designed by folks that are designed for children. Because they're very simple. We're very tired professors. We meet together to kind of as a bonding exercise more than anything else. This is not my tactical group. My tactical group is the history professors I play with tonight and every Sunday. This is not the super actory group that I, play with on Saturday mornings. We play a lot of RPGs, Emily.
Yeah, we do play a lot of RPGs, but there's but Alice has mentioned like how many of us have played online games. Like there's a variety of different types of online games. So one of the games we talked about, Regency Love, if you have an iPhone, I don't think they're on Android. You can play, that's just on your phone. There's a lot of the games we've mentioned are either free or quite affordable, and you don't need to get anything additional. But like there's also, do you want to play with others? There's a lot, and there's a lot out there.
Yeah, and Rose, in terms of like Gothic flavored games, there's a ton in the indie space. One of the ones that we're going to be exploring with some of our friends who are queer studies folks and Scottish history folks for our Scholars React series that we're creating this summer is a breakup simulator set in 1745 after the Battle of Culloden, the kind of massacre of the Highland Scots, called Inverness Nights. Very Gothic, very, very weird. A feature, it's by an NB author, and so one of the characters is legible as potentially trans in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, a lot of different levels of indie games kind of tackle the Gothic. And if you go to our itch.io links, which I'm putting back into this chat, and if you just click through E.C. Friedman as well, there's text-based games that explore Gothic stories. The Gothic is kind of something that people really are into. Right. So thanks, Rose.
Right. So going to Amanda's question about, I'm curious, is the lack of racial representation in Austin-inspired games because of who the developers are? I would say that it really. There's the it depends answer, but a more specific one is a lot of the indie games we're going on are just like a few people. So
one or two people.
Like T for 3, which does Regency Love, is mainly I believe East Asian, and that sort of depends. I don't know the background of the person, Spiral Atlas, who does Northanger Abbey. However, there's been longer conversations in more expensive studio produced games about representation. So you might have something like the most recent Tomb Raider that says, oh, we had Indigenous experts come and talk to us. And then people in the Indigenous community are like, ooh, do they have names? this seems really problematic. And then there are some games like Never Alone, which I'll put a link to in a bit, which are very much tied to the cultures that they're representing and coming from designers and voices there. I mean, so on one hand, the Assassin's Creed games actually do try to find scholarly experts to talk to them.
There's a nice Haitian Rev one.
Yeah.
But it is worth noting, I was part of Robin Mitchell's Clubhouse chat with MC Hammer earlier this week, where I asked her, amazing book, Venus Noire, about representations of Black women in French 19th century art. You should buy it. It's great. But I asked her, because she's thinking a lot about kind of moving into other genres to depict Black women in the 19th century. And I said, so we've been playing these games and there's not a whole lot of representation. Is there a figure that you've been studying in the archives that you would want to include? And she was like, I don't think we're there yet. I don't, because the dangers of bad representation are so high that there's a kind of cost. We need a critical mass of pop culture representations, right? It can't just be Bridgerton, for example. It's got to be we've got to have a whole bunch so that we can have some shitty ones, which is why Emily and I, while we were watching the playthrough, we're like, oh, really great, an Austen game jam. If we could teach Austen nerds, especially Austen nerds that are Black or people of color, how to design these kinds of games, which you can use with very simple, free on the internet, kind of tools like Twine. If we could get a whole bunch of these games made from a whole bunch of perspectives and have them all land at once, if one of the, if they weren't perfect, we'd at least have a bunch of them, which would be super cool.
I'm gonna put some things in the chat right now.
Yeah, thanks Emily for putting stuff in the chat. Garrity, my beautiful student, I love you so much. Thank you for such a great question about language. It's interesting when these different games choose to embrace the Austen language, which is an awful lot. Like the Northanger Abbey game, which is fascinating as an example of close reading, because it is lifting directly from the novel, but you don't realize it right away. We had to I actually did some text searching to go, oh my God, that's in there, really? But it's kind of being transformed just by context in interesting sorts of ways. I love, Bianca, that your Strahd campaign has gone Northanger Abbey, and I hope we get to talk to you all about it when your campaign wraps, so that we can. I would love to hear more about that. Rose, you asked about how pandemic has changed gaming as a field. I think there's a lot more board games on places like Board Game Arena that are available for people to play. I think a lot of people like me who were very hesitant to turn our role-playing game experience into a virtual thing as opposed to a thing that you do with a bunch of snacks and some beer. Necessity has made it so that we had to do that. We had to go to places like Roll20 and Zoom. One of my local game participants who'd moved away is now back part of our party. We're playing more often because we can, because we also don't have any social lives. That's starting to change. But yeah, so I think that the pandemic has really exploded people's interest in all kinds of games, which I'm teaching a class in the fall on games and narrative. It's for the first time ever at our university. It filled in hours, which is super amazing. We don't want to take time and shine away from our next fellow presenters, Kate and Kat. So we're going to close down here, but feel free to keep the comments and questions coming, both in the comments on these videos, as well as Emily is EMK at Twitter. I'm FRIEDE at Twitter. And we are kind of very online people, obviously. We are looking for curiosities and questions to tackle future videos because you are our audience. So thanks so much for watching. We're so glad to see you all.